And back to our top story this morning. All eyes are on Queen's Park as the Ford government uses the notwithstanding clause to try to push through legislation aimed at stopping an education workers' strike. To explain the legal implications of this, I'm joined live now by employment lawyer Howard Levitt. Howard, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, watching, all of this start to unfold as an employment lawyer, what was your reaction when you heard that the notwithstanding clause was going to be used instead of going back to the bargaining table?
I thought it was brilliant. It's an artillery shell right into the artery of the union movement. So at this point, parents in the province have been upset for years at being essentially held hostage, being required to stay home from work. Employers are upset at strikes in the education sector. And there's a lot more parents than there are union members in this province. And they're getting increasingly exercised all the time. You see, in normal strikes, it's the employer against the workers of that company and that union. So if the union asks for too much, the company will go bankrupt. So they can't ask for too much. And if the employer doesn't offer enough, there'll be a strike. But it's different in this sector because it's really the workers against the parents, not against their employer. So it's really unfair. And I think Ford has it right in doing this. I think Ford has it right in sensing public opinion on the subject. Now, and by the way, using it without notwithstanding clause, it's unchallengeable. There's no legal challenge that could be effective.
And that's the thing. So first off, so the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, they have spoken out against this, saying the exact opposite, saying that this notwithstanding clause was never meant to be used during negotiations. Doesn't this just take away then the rights of a union to negotiate a deal, as that's what unions are for? That's why they have been implemented.
Well, there's lots of unions that are essential services, which education should be, and they don't get to strike. They have compulsory arbitrations. This is consistent with that because, again, it's not workers against their employer. It's workers against parents. That's what education strikes are all about. And so this is exactly where the notwithstanding clause is properly used. I don't know why the Canadian Civil Liberties Association says otherwise, except they probably oppose ever using notwithstanding clause for anything. But the governments of the country all agreed there should be a notwithstanding clause because at the end of the day, Parliament is paramount, or the legislature is paramount over the courts. That's why a notwithstanding clause was put in.
Now, you talked about essential services and essential workers. These education workers are not essential. Therefore, they don't get the benefits of going to arbitration and getting those pay increases consistently like other essential workers do, like police and emergency services. So in this case, if they're not essential, isn't this then kind of making them essential without giving them the benefits of being an essential worker?
That's correct. And in the short term, that's what they had to do because they were about to have a strike. I think they should be made essential. And what the government did is impose the increases that essential workers have generally been getting in the province. So they're really putting them in the same position as essential workers. And they should be essential workers for just the reason that they're holding not the government hostage, not their employer hostage, but parents hostage. And I think parents are probably ecstatic about this, not having to stay home from work now.
There are some parents who I'm sure are happy about that. There are other parents, though, who have formed parent groups who are clearly behind the unions. And a lot of those parents are union members as well. So there is that to it. In terms of a challenge,
I suspect there are a very, very small minority of parents fostered by the union movement. I don't believe it for a moment.
Okay. Well, I know that there's like, for example, the Ontario Parent Action Network, who has come out saying that they support their teachers, their caregivers, and they want to make sure that those people who are not being able to afford what they can based on those salaries are able to get a raise, a consistent one, throughout their deals throughout the years when they're working, especially because they have an important job there. I'll ask you.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll ask you about the challenge. You made a comment about this not being challengeable. Is that truly the case? Is there something that can be done so that the unions can not just walk out on Friday, but have a legal challenge in order to reverse this if it actually does come into play?
Well, no, the notwithstanding clause was put in as part of the Constitution, as part of the Charter. It is unchallengeable. And I know the union movement is trying to get the federal government to put pressure on the province, but unless they can put political pressure on them, there's no legal pressure they can put on them. And by the way, if they walk out on Friday, they're committing an illegal act and are subject to fines and
Yes.
penalties.
Right, up to $4,000 a day for individuals. I want to ask you lastly, Howard, is this not a slippery slope? So the government doesn't get their way at the bargaining table. Is this not a slippery slope pulling this out and using it? Let's say there wasn't this angle where we're talking about parents versus teachers that you're mentioning.
Okay.
Let's say this is something else completely different. The government doesn't get their way, but they want it. Is this not a slippery slope?
Well, it is and it isn't. It is in the way that you say, but I think there'd be horrible political opposition from employer groups too if government essentially gutted collective bargaining, as opposed to a situation like this where it is parents versus education workers as opposed to parents against government, against workers against government. It would be a slippery slope, but I can't imagine for a moment the government would start gutting the right to strike generally, where this doesn't apply. This is really an anomalous situation where it's justified, in my view.
Oh, right. In your view, again, this
Yes.
does, though, essentially gut collective bargaining in the end. It
Only-
does, of
only
this
in this-
union, of this case.
Yeah, it's essentially making them an essential service. It's fundamentally what it's doing.
Right.
In the short term, I suspect they'll follow it by making them an essential service, because they are.
Right. We'll see about that. Howard, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
No problem.